declare open this public hearing of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Law Enforcement into law enforcement capabilities in relation to child exploitation. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. These are public proceedings being video streamed live via the parliamentary website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as contempt. It is also a contempt to give false and misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the grounds on which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I'm joined today by Mr Rapoli, and we also have some committee members participating via video conference or teleconference. We have Mr O'Brien and we have Mr Woods at this point in time. And Senator Antic has just joined us.
Thank you very much.
I remind committee members who are participating remotely and who are not speaking to mute their microphones. If there are no objections from the committee members, I propose that the committee agree Monday the 6th of March as the date for responses to any questions that are taken on notice. I now welcome representatives of Meta. I would like to acknowledge your contributions to this inquiry to date, and thank you for making yourselves available to answer the committee's questions. And I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? And then I'll invite you to make an opening statement. At the conclusion of your remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Chair. My name is Mia Garlick. I'm a Regional Director of Policy for Meta.
Thank you. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair and all members. I'm Josh Machin. I'm the Head of Public Policy for Australia at Meta.
Thank you. Welcome. Would one of you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll make some brief remarks and then look forward to the committee's questions. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee's inquiry. I know that we're all in agreement that this is an extremely important issue, looking into the issue of law enforcement capabilities to combat child exploitation. And we certainly welcome the chance to share more about the work that we do to combat this abhorrent material from being shared on our platform. I do think it's fair to say that technology offers young people tremendous opportunities to stay connected with friends and family, no matter where they live, to express themselves and connect with like-minded people around hobbies, causes or other interests. However, we all sadly know that online services can also be misused and abused in ways that harm young people. And any use of the internet to harm a young person is unacceptable, and all of us, government, industry, civil society and the broader community, must work together to protect young people. We know that as a technology company, we can't do this work alone, and that's why we collaborate widely with all safety stakeholders as much as possible to safeguard young people online. Meta's been an industry leader in initiatives to combat child exploitation. Globally, we have more than 40,000 people working on safety and security at the company, and we've invested more than $23 Australian billion on safety and security in the last 7 years. So across our apps, we have policies, we have tools, we have proactive detection technology, and we have programs that work to combat child exploitation and the sexualisation of minors on our platform. We've developed world-leading AI to detect and remove this type of content from our services, and we share this technology with others to help them combat this issue more broadly across the internet. We're very proud to see, for example, that 2 technologies that we have developed to detect identical and near identical photos and videos and made open source are now being used by the Australian Federal Police. The impact of our efforts is clear. In the last quarter alone, we removed 30.1 million pieces of content for child sexual exploitation globally. 99.5% of that we detected and removed proactively before anyone had to see it and report it to us. When we detect CSAM, we remove it and report it to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, and that's a US-based nonprofit that, in compliance with US law, investigates and refers cases to law enforcement in Australia and around the world. In addition to proactive detection technology and referrals, we continue to develop and build innovative new tools to prevent the generation of harmful content. So we have safety notices on Messenger, which are banners that provide tips on spotting suspicious activity and taking action to report or block a message when it doesn't seem right. And we use machine learning to offer these tips at targeted moments to flag suspicious accounts attempting to connect with minors. We've also developed more than 30 tools in the last couple of years to support teens and to help them have an age-appropriate experience on our apps. And this includes things like age verification and much stronger privacy defaults. And we've been working with NCMEC on a new industry-leading tool to stop sextortion and prevent the non-consensual sharing of teens' intimate images. And we'll have more to say on this in the near future. Our commitment to this issue doesn't just stop with our platform. We've helped rebuild the case management tool for NCMEC to help ensure their investigators can get to the most important cases quickly. And we've also led the industry's launch of Project Protect, a multi-million-dollar fund to support research and innovation and collective action to thwart online child exploitation. And this is through the Technology Coalition, which is an 18-member industry association dedicated to fighting online child exploitation. Of course, working with government and law enforcement is an essential part of our work, and we really value the strong working relationship we have with the E-Safety Commissioner and her office, and we continue to work with law enforcement and appreciate the strong working relationship with the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation in particular. So we're very pleased to be having this opportunity to support the work of the committee by sharing more about these efforts and, obviously building on the submission and our appearance before this committee under the 46th Parliament. We do appreciate to date that we've been the only technology company to appear before the committee, both under the previous Parliament and to the current hearings so far under this committee. And we do encourage the committee to invite other industry stakeholders so that you can get a broader view across the industry about the different activities being undertaken. But with that, thank you very much again for the opportunity, and we look forward to the discussion and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just ask a couple of questions before I hand over to committee members. But I do take your point and want to place on the record how much we appreciate the fact that you've come forward to give evidence today and that you're being a very willing participant. What I'd like to ask today is, when it comes to the challenges, and we all know the benefits of social media platforms, we're all avid users of it, but there are still major challenges in terms of the issue we're discussing today. So can you outline to us what those challenges are? And at the same time, my understanding is that live streaming is a major issue when it comes to the exploitation of children and young people. Can you give us any comments in relation to those two areas? What are still the challenges and what can be done proactively in relation to live streaming?
I'm happy to open up with some general remarks and then my colleague Josh Machin might have some additional comments to make. I think that, obviously a core focus for all of us working across this space needs to be on prevention as a starting point to try to prevent this content from ever being created to begin with. And obviously there's a range of offline strategies and tactics that can be undertaken for that. But from our perspective, what we're focused on is trying to prevent contact being occurring on our services. And we have a range of different tools and techniques that we undertake to achieve that. That includes removing suspicious and fake accounts and building on and investing and increasing our investment in proactive detection technology, both in terms of fake accounts, but also trying to identify if there could be a suspicious activity of somebody trying to contact a minor, and those safety notices that I mentioned in our opening statement. In any given month, 100 million of those safety notices can be seen, and then also allowing people to block and report accounts And then obviously investing in proactive detection technology to detect and remove this type of content and refer it to law enforcement through NCMEC so that they can pursue perpetrators. So there's a range of different things. I think there's sort of no one thing that will assist, but that's certainly, you know, looking across the gamut from prevention to detection and reporting. That's the broad strategy that we undertake. Josh, did you want to add anything there?
I think you've expressed that really well, Mia. But Chair, just to go specifically to your question about whether live streaming is a particular part of the concern, I guess we're conscious that there are a number of different elements related to child abuse that we want to be on guard for on our platforms. So I think the first bucket is probably around solicitation or inappropriate contact between adults and minors, and Mia has shared a little bit about some of the proactive steps that we've taken in that respect. The second area is obviously around sharing of CSAM material. Every reshare of one of those pieces of material is a re-victimisation of the child in question, and one share is too many. And then there's almost a third issue around contact offending. And so in the discussion around live streaming, I think it's primarily couched in relation to that third bucket, which is obviously incredibly serious. It often has a transnational component. I'm very happy to go into detail there, but we think it's important to be proactively preventing, detecting and responding to all of these different manifestations of harm around child abuse that could potentially occur.
Thank you. The other question is in relation to law enforcement. Do you believe that the relationship that you have with Australian law enforcement, primarily between the AFP, is effective? Or is there other things and still challenges there that we need to be made aware of?
I think we have a good relationship with Australian law enforcement, and we certainly sort of have we have a dedicated liaison team for them to engage with. I think, you know, we've got someone available for them, in the right time zones, and then obviously we have an online portal where they can submit any requests for access to data, and we work to process those. We triage them and make sure that we action the most serious ones as fast as possible, and then work constructively with them in a wide range of activities as well to promote greater awareness around online safety and things like that. So I feel that our working relationship is very strong. I'm not sure, Josh, if you wanted to add anything.
No, I think you're right, Mia. Incredibly strong relationship with law enforcement. We're very grateful for the great cooperation we have with the Australian Centre for Countering Child Exploitation, but a number of different entities. There is perhaps, Chair, one area that might be worth drawing to your attention. I think a long-running concern, particularly in the relationship between law enforcement and technology companies, has been about the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process, which is quite a bureaucratic international relations process that law enforcement have needed to follow in instances where they're aiming to access content, or in some instances data from US-based companies such as ourselves. There is some really exciting and excellent work that's underway at the moment following the signing of a Cloud Act agreement between Australia and the US. And there's been a process led out of the Attorney General's Department to put that into practice. That's going to make a very significant difference in providing a much clearer and easier legal framework for companies to provide Australian law enforcement assistance in ways that's much faster. Australia is one of the first jurisdictions in the world that's going to have access to this. The UK does as well, but Australian implementation has really been fast-tracked. And so I just wanted to flag that's one area that's currently being implemented and currently in train, which will hopefully assist in taking our relationship and collaboration with law enforcement to even better levels. And so that's an area that's getting some quite dedicated attention from both governments and on our side as well. And we're very hopeful about some of the change that could bring.
Thank you very much. And the other issue is encryption. My understanding is that Meta intends to roll out the end-to-end encryption, and there has been concern from the Australian Institute of Criminology that this may desist from helping identifying the sort of material that we are focused on today.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to sort of talk through in broad terms about some of our work in this space. I mean, I think, again, once we're talking about potential impact of encryption, that's focused on the detection part of online harms. But obviously, again, we really want to make sure that we're focusing on prevention as much as possible. And so a number of the tools and techniques that we have to try to prevent there being any sort of inappropriate conduct and contact on our services is sort of the first thing to focus on. But in relation to encryption, I think one of the challenges with this conversation, and certainly why we made the announcement several years ago that we were going to move towards encryption on Messenger, was so that we could have these conversations. And we essentially need to re-educate the market, because I think one of the challenges with the perception around encryption is that a lot of it has been led by sort of the perception has been led by the first movers to encrypted services. So obviously iMessage, very widely used in Australia and is been end-to-end encrypted for a while now. And Apple in 2021, according to NCMEC's latest report, only made 160 referrals to NCMEC, whereas if you compare that with, say, WhatsApp, which is already encrypted, in the 2021 reporting timeframe, they made 1.37 million, and that's been steadily rising. So we've taken a strong approach on what sort of safety and security can be applied in an encrypted world, using both behavioural signals, proactive detection on unencrypted services. And so it's a different way of trying to enforce safety and security in an encrypted world, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. And that's why we've really welcomed the chance to have these conversations both with the Attorney General's Department and with Australian law enforcement over the last couple of years to make sure that we're sort of re-educating the debate around safety and security in an encrypted world.
The US National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children estimates that this will end-to-end encryption will reduce CAM reports it receives by 50%. So your response to that?
Well, I think there's two responses there. So the first response is, I mean, if you look at, say, WhatsApp's reporting, that's been steadily increasing over the last couple of years. And when WhatsApp first started reporting, it was at several 100,000. Now it's up to 1.37 million. And the nature of these behavioural models is that the machine learning builds on itself. So I think that we'll continue to see that. And then we've also, to make sure that we're properly understanding the nature of our reports to NCMEC, done some research and found that I think, Josh, keep me honest, there was 6 unique videos generating about 90% of reports, and we found that the vast majority of shares were not with malicious intent, and these were insights that we then used to run a new education campaign so that people understand that any resharing or engagement with this content is abhorrent regardless of the intent. So I think, we're confident that we can continue to invest in safety and security and education campaigns even as more surfaces become encrypted. I'm not sure, Josh, if you want to add anything there.
I think you've expressed it well, Mia, but Chair, just to summarise that, this is something we've been really carefully working on for more than 4 years. There's some really exciting, innovative, safety-related work, thinking about safety in an end-to-end encrypted environment. And the reason for us doing this is because we think there's a lot of promise where we can offer consumers both the privacy and the cybersecurity protection that comes with end-to-end encryption, but at the same time have the safest possible private messaging. So very happy to provide any more detail if that's useful.
I just have a question from Mr. Wood, and his question goes to the ability to determine if child abuse is being live streamed, and secondly, the ability to bring down and how does the process work and the timing of it under the end-to-end encryption. And then I'll go to Mr. Rapoli.
Certainly. I mean, I think so. What we're trying to do is make sure that there's a range of different techniques and tools being used to identify potentially suspicious behaviour. So, again, focused on prevention as the first strategy in terms of removal of fake accounts and blocking people from being able to have contact to begin with, and then focusing on what other signals we can use, both in terms of access to the metadata or unencrypted services, or if there's user reports. And so from that, that's why WhatsApp has a much higher rate of referrals than, say, other encrypted services, because we're looking at a range of different both behavioural signals, metadata, and unencrypted surfaces for proactive detection.
Mr. Rapoli.
Thank you. Meta's joined along with Google and Microsoft and 15 other tech companies in the Project Protect. Can you just give us a little bit of information on that and how well you guys are or aren't working together on making this happen? Because obviously everyone needs to work together to make this happen. I'm just very curious to see how those other companies are going with it, and especially, as you just said, companies like Apple before have only had 140 things that they flagged, where WhatsApp have had up into 1.3 million. Like, that doesn't sound acceptable from Apple, if you ask me.
Thanks very much, Mr. Rapoli. Really appreciate the question. I'll kick us off, and Mia might have more to share. So you're absolutely right that there are a number of different ways that large multinational technology companies have been collaborating in order to address this problem. And you're correct that Project Protect via the Technology Coalition is one of the really key ways that we've been working to do that. So we announced this Project Protect investment about 2 years ago in the middle of the pandemic, and it has a number of different limbs. The first is around technological innovation. So all of the companies putting into a pot in order to do that research and development to look for safety mitigations that are going to be effective with changes in technology and changes in the behaviour of these bad actors. So it's a very significant multi-million-dollar investment, but it helps to bring all of the innovation that these tech companies are known for and applying it to this particular problem. So number one's around innovation. The second area of collaboration is particularly around research, making sure that we understand this problem offline and how it manifests on online services. And so there's joint research that we've all been working on it as well. And the third area is, of course, in relation to disruption or sharing information about the trends that we're seeing. One additional element of I guess it's almost collaboration that you could add, but all of these companies are obligated under US law, or US-based companies, to report material that they find on their services to NCMEC. And what you see is significant collaboration between the companies in how they use technological tools from NCMEC to scan their services in order to proactively detect the material. So there's obviously some limitations in our ability to share the material itself between the specific companies because it's illegal to possess it. But there's that central coordination and clearinghouse that often happens via NCMEC as well. I'd add that there's additional collaboration under government structures as well. So, for example, we're a supporter of the voluntary principles for CSEA, child sexual abuse material, that a number of the Five Eyes companies have really pioneered. And all of the companies are working together in the development of online safety codes in Australia as well, under the Online Safety Act, which covers this material. So the collaboration probably spans quite a few different areas, particularly for the large companies. But what I'd also add is we recognise that smaller companies might have the same level of willingness in combating this problem, but not the same resources as some of the larger ones. And so that's why many of the tools and techniques that we're using to detect child abuse on our services, we're also open sourcing so that we can bring the capability up across industry, and the smaller and medium companies are also able to access some of those tools. Mia mentioned that some of those technologies we open sourced a couple of years ago have in fact been tested by the Australian Federal Police and found to be quite useful. So in terms of the willingness of particular other companies to adopt some of those technologies, that's obviously a question for them, but hopefully that outlines a little bit some of the ways that we work as part of the cross-industry coalitions to make a significant difference on this problem.
Lou's got a question on that one, I think.
Yes, Mr Woods wants the call to follow up on the question I put on his behalf.
Thanks.
Mr Woods.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. And thanks very much for appearing. I'm just trying to get in layman's terms and when it comes to the live streaming. Now, what's been reported to me by child protection groups, they're saying the live streaming, people pay $20 to have some poor child abused overseas. It doesn't have the ability when it comes to companies to, with the intention of actually determining whether this abuse is being live streamed. So number one, I want to find out whether you actually have that ability. Is it instant or or the technology is not there? And secondly, once you become aware, the timing of this, like, does it mean there's a process where forms have to be put in? It takes 24 hours and obviously that the crime's completely been committed. And so just answer those two, please, in more layman's terms. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Mr Wood. I'll kick off and then might see if Josh has anything more to add. I mean, I think that if we become aware that any child is in danger through any type of report on our service, that would be subject to an emergency disclosure request. And there have been many instances over the years where we have either received a report or information to become aware that a child is in danger, or have become aware of it through other means through our policies and processes. And then we do make emergency disclosures and work swiftly to do everything we can to collaborate with law enforcement to try to get assistance for any potential victim. So I think that's hopefully that gives you some comfort that we have teams on standby to have a rapid response if there's any awareness on our part of any endangerment happening. And then I think there's a number of different ways that this type of content can be detected depending on how it's being perpetrated. So in terms of live streaming, we do have there's obviously the ability to report it. We also have if it's say happening through Facebook groups or something like that. At this point in time, we could we do have the ability to identify if there's something. Like if a live stream is happening in a particular area and there's a high degree of viewers or things like that, where we can go in to try to interrupt the stream. I'm not sure, Josh, if you wanted to add anything else there.
I might add two additional things which might be helpful, Mr. Wood. I'll try to put it in layman's terms, as you say. So certainly that type of behaviour that you've been describing is obviously a criminal behaviour, and we do see some pretty sophisticated criminal groups who unfortunately can perpetrate really abhorrent conduct. And so the work that we're doing to detect behavioural signals on our services is really effective here. So what do I mean by behavioural signals? Well, a normal, say, WhatsApp user like you or I will have a particular pattern where we'll probably message most people one-to-one. Maybe we're in a couple of groups. Maybe if we're very popular, there'll be a large group of people. But a user who is part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise has very different behaviour on encrypted services than an ordinary user. And so even if we are not able to see the content, there's some pretty effective work that we've been able to do to analyse the metadata based on the behaviour of the individuals involved. And so we have had some incredibly successful, not just removal of accounts, but disruption of sophisticated criminal enterprises based on this technology. It's very innovative. It's obviously not foolproof. There's a lot of innovation that's been happening in this space, but it is something where we're seeing significant promise. As Mia mentioned earlier, and the chair and Mr. Repicoli mentioned too, WhatsApp was able to make 1.37 million referrals to NCMEC in the year of 2021. So even if it's not possible to see the content, there is still ways to get actionable intelligence to law enforcement so they can take action against these groups. And the second area that I would mention is how important it is to have partnerships on the ground, particularly in the countries where this type of contact offending occurs. So unfortunately, the Philippines is a jurisdiction where this unfortunately happens. And so we've worked incredibly closely with safety partners on the ground there, but also organisations like the AFP. They have a presence in the Philippines as well, in order to make sure that we can follow up and detect any leads about this type of contact offending or behaviour that's happening on the ground. So just to add to Mia's response, the technology is promising. There's steps that we can take to detect it, but we really need to take a comprehensive approach that includes technology. It includes partnerships and programs with NGOs. It includes cooperation with law enforcement. We need to tackle this problem in a whole range of different ways.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. So just a quick, and just the timing, if you become aware, I heard you had groups who can interrupt. Is it one where it takes, like, can they do it instantaneously, or does it need authority? Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Just to reiterate, I mean, where there's any child in danger or any other threat to life, then we move swiftly without the need for a formal request, like immediately upon becoming aware of it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Senator Shoebridge, you had a follow-up question, and then after you, we'll go to Mr. O'Brien. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Chair, and thanks for your appearance today. When you're talking about, I think you've mentioned your preparations to go into end-to-end encryption, and you're talking about the educative steps you're taking. That's interesting, but of course, I suppose many of the submissions we've had have said that what actual technological or other steps you're taking to identify child sexual abuse material if you roll out end-to-end encryption. For example, are you looking at client-side scanning? And if so, what steps are you taking in that regard, for starters?
I'm happy to lead off, Senator, and then see if Josh has anything more to add. So we are, I mean, obviously it's up to device manufacturers, what approach they take to client-side scanning. That's certainly not something that we are considering. The nature of encryption and the popularity of it is because it provides safety and security for people's messages. And, I think in the context of the many data breaches that we've seen, we can really see the value of encryption. And I think the UN Commissioner on Human Rights has come out very publicly criticising client-side scanning as just an extension of surveillance. And so I think that's, from our perspective and from, the feedback that we get from consumer groups and consumers is that it's an unwarranted intrusion into their privacy. And that's why we've invested so significantly in a wide range of other techniques and measures that can both preserve the value that people get from encryption, which is privacy and security, but still try to make sure that we're raising the standard for safety and security in an encrypted world.
Okay, well, that was a very generic and general statement, but I suppose apart from making generic statements, what does that actually look like? Are you looking at automated content moderation? And if so, what's the nature of your steps on automated content moderation?
Sure. So I think there's sort of the three buckets of it. So first is in looking at behavioural signals. So, as to sort of build on what Josh said earlier, if somebody is using an online service for criminal purposes, their behaviour is typically very different for just a regular user. And so there's a range of different signals that we can use there. There's also looking at metadata and unencrypted surfaces. And in unencrypted surfaces, we can use proactive content detection technologies, and then also if any content is reported to us, that will unencrypt it so that we can then see that content and we can also take action on it. So that's sort of the broad overview. I'm not sure, Josh, if you wanted to add anything.
No, I think you've expressed it well, Mia, but Senator Shoebridge, happy to provide any more detail about these types of integrity measures because they are very innovative. They're industry-leading steps that we're taking. So we talked a little bit about behavioural signals and metadata earlier, but to give an example around reporting, for example, what we've been testing is some of the ways that we can encourage users to report to us if they see something in messaging that is that's concerning. And particularly when it comes to young people, they respond to prompts in different ways to adults. And so sometimes asking them to report something sounds quite intimidating. So we've been co-designing, for example, notices or interstitials that we can provide in messaging that are encryption resilient, so they still encourage a young person to report something to us, which means then that we decrypt it, that we're able to see what the content of those messages are. And then exactly as you've suggested, we use automated content moderation or artificial intelligence based on all of our knowledge of violating material over those reports, so that we can very quickly find if there's child abuse material or something else that represents a threat or risk to the child as well. So just to go into a little more detail on Mia's answer on how some of those technologies work, they're very new, they're very innovative, but so far they seem to be quite promising.
All right, to get some handle on how successful Meta has been, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children indicated that Facebook and Meta was the overwhelming source of reports they had for online child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation. I think out of 29 million reports, some 22,100,000 or so of those were in relation to Facebook. How many of those had you proactively identified yourself prior to the report coming from the NECEM, National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children? How many of those 22,100,000 had you proactively identified yourself that year?
So we've got the Community Standards Enforcement Report data that we update each quarter, and I think the last quarterly report indicated that 99.5% we were proactively detecting and reporting. But I think it's also helpful, we ourselves have looked at the data that we report to NCMEC and analysing 2 representative months in 2020 found that 90% of the content that we were reporting was the same or visually similar to previously reported content. And with that insight, we then drove a further education campaign, because we were seeing that a lot of people were sharing this content without malicious intent, which is kind of shocking and horrifying, I'm sure, to a number of us participating in this hearing. And so, I think the data alone doesn't tell all of the story, and that's why we keep looking at different aspects of it to identify new insights and what more we need to be doing, either in a technological sense or a programmatic sense.
Well, the data
Final
tells a
question,
shocking story
Senator,
in relation.
before we move on.
Sorry, the data tells a pretty shocking story in relation to Meta, and you can see why people are deeply concerned about your moving to end-to-end encryption without having some actual clear identifiable answers and some working solutions for this. And I'm not persuaded from the evidence you've given that there's anything you've identified that is going to be proactive and successful before you roll out end-to-end encryption. And I'm happy for you to persuade me otherwise, but the scale of the problem Meta has does not seem to be addressed by the scale of investment or the response that you're identified in this committee.
Well, Senator, I think the important thing to look at is the progress that has been made in relation to WhatsApp's reporting, because that, I think, is an optimistic story. So if you look at the beginning of WhatsApp's reporting, there was only several 100,000 reports being made. And again, obviously, these are much higher numbers than is being reported on Apple's iMessage, which has been in the market and is used by millions of Australians and has been encrypted for many, many years, where they're only doing 160 reports. But WhatsApp's reporting has steadily increased because the nature of this technology is that it's machine learning, so it learns on itself and improves over time. And so, that's where, WhatsApp has increased from several 100,000 up to 1.37 million. And so I don't think looking at the straight numbers now is an indication of where it's going to be in future as we move to more encrypted surfaces.
We'll have to go now to Mr. O'Brien, and if we have some more time, we'll come back. Mr. O'Brien, you're
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Josh and Mia, for presenting today, and really appreciate it. It is a very difficult space that we work in, undoubtedly. I'm just interested, we're hearing about referrals, but do you keep a track of the actual outcome, convictions and proven offences?
I'm happy to jump in with that one, Deputy Chair. So we don't have any data on that particular point that we could share, but as Mia mentioned at the start, we do have dedicated teams that work with Australian law enforcement and work closely with them in lawful ways in order to support their investigations. And so we do often hear back about the success of our efforts in being able to detect some type of child abuse or successfully bring someone to prosecution. That's obviously also a reflection of excellent policing and prosecution as well. But we do hear honestly, some pretty incredible stories about children that have been able to be saved because of the incredible work that our investigators, our safety teams have been able to uncover. So I don't have any data for you particularly on that front, but we do quite regularly hear about the really incredible success in protecting children that we're able to be a part of.
That's so I would understand you don't have any data to present immediately to me today, but surely you keep a record of how many proven offences occur on your platforms and what they are, the nature of them.
Well, obviously, if data on our platform is subject to a disclosure to law enforcement, then we're required under law to keep records of that interaction with police. But there's what we're looking for is removal of the material from our services. And Mia mentioned an interesting stat, just to give a little context, which might be useful, in that we found that 75% of our referrals to NCMEC are done by people with non-malicious intent. So this is someone, for example, who is, with the best of intentions, sharing child abuse in order to raise awareness that there's a problem or to warn people not to watch it. And so while that under law triggers a referral for us to NCMEC, and it's unlawful and they should not have done that, that's a re-victimisation of the child and it violates our policies, law enforcement might choose not to pursue that person because this was an accident, or it had happened one time, or they didn't quite understand that it was unlawful. And so I think drawing that connection between the removal of material and the successful prosecution of an offender can't always be easy. So hopefully that context is useful.
I get that some complaints or some the evidence doesn't stack up, or there are multiple reasons. But I'm talking about actual convictions. I mean, surely if a platform that you run facilitates the rape of a child and someone's convicted for that, you should know about that, and you should have some form of record as to how many, if that is the case, children are being abused on your networks. But you're telling me you don't.
I might just jump in.
In terms of convictions, in terms of proven convictions.
Yeah, I think it's important as well to keep in mind the role of NCMEC here. So our understanding is that law enforcement is supposed to report some of this data to NCMEC, but I think that doesn't always consistently happen. So it's possibly not able to draw that connection. I mean, in terms of the data that we are focused on in terms of our transparency measures, we're really obviously, trying to focus on both prevention, but also looking at proactive detection, because our goal is to try to make sure that we're able to stop this type of activity from happening or being generated via our services in the first place, but then secondly, trying to make sure that people don't see it to begin with. So that's really the focus of the data points that we record and disclose.
Right, okay. Just to back to...
Final question.
Just to, don't want to seem like I'm labouring on it, but I'm in the Jason Wood camp, and you need to explain these things to me in layman's terms. Is there any record of you stopping the live streaming of child exploitation material while it's happening? Have you ever done that?
Deputy Chair, I'd be happy, we could maybe take off notice and share as a follow-up some real life examples of where we have worked to rescue people or to prevent crimes from occurring, because that we certainly have.
I'm not talking about. I'm talking about the actual stopping of a stream of live streaming child exploitation material. I'm sure. I'm sure that we all want that not to happen in the first place, but when a little human being is being raped, we want it to, if it's commercial, we want that to obviously stop immediately, so that incentive for it to continue isn't there. Wondering if you can give me any example or numbers on where you've stopped something like that happening.
Deputy Chair, I'm happy to take that on notice. I don't have numbers to hand right now, but I'm happy to follow up with more details.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Shoebridge, you have a final question.
Thanks again, Chair. You said earlier in your evidence that one of the reasons we should have some comfort in what Meta is doing is you've been developing the online safety codes. Do you remember that?
I think I gave that as an example of ways that we collaborate with other companies, but happy to talk to the codes. Yep.
They were rejected last week by the E-Safety Commissioner, rejected as not sufficiently protecting children and not providing a sufficiently safe online environment. Do you have any observations about that, and can you tell us why they were rejected from your part?
Yeah, of course, Senator. So obviously we can only provide the Meta perspective. These codes are being done industry-wide, not by any company alone. In fact, last I counted, I think there's about 70 different companies actively involved in the working groups for these codes, and about 200 who are commenting on them. So it is a very significant effort. You're right that industry's been working very hard and had submitted a series of draft codes for the Commissioner's reaction, and they received feedback in the last week or two that there were some additional areas that the Commissioner would like added or amended in those particular codes. She hasn't yet formally rejected them in terms of moving to developing a standard. But companies, we're seeing a lot of goodwill and a lot of hard work by companies in order to develop those codes and to respond to the feedback. They've undertaken, the industry associations who are leading the drafting have undertaken a number of roundtables with stakeholders in order to seek feedback, to consult on those particular areas. And I guess it's a little challenging because I'm conscious those draft codes are not publicly available, and it's not my decision. Well,
why does Meta think they should be publicly available? And obviously there's a major public interest here. The E-Safety Commissioner has said that the proposals don't appropriately protect community standards. Does Meta think that they should be made public?
Yeah, we do, Senator. We're always an advocate for transparency. It's obviously not our decision, but we think there would be a lot of benefit in the public debate in putting the codes out there so people can see what companies would already be proposing. My understanding is the industry associations had wanted to give the E-Safety Commissioner the courtesy and the time to consider those codes before making it available. So I don't believe there was a motivation to evade any transparency, but now's a pretty good time to look at that question again. So we're certainly in
I come back to why they were rejected.
Thank you.
What was it that didn't meet the appropriate
Thank you, Senator
community
Shoebridge.
safety
Your last
standards?
question.
Could I?
What was it that didn't meet, in the eyes of the E-Safety Commissioner, appropriate community safety standards in the codes which Meta was in part developing?
Senator, could I suggest that perhaps we follow up with some material on notice for you here? I'm very happy to answer the question.
I think that's a good idea. If you could take that on notice, because our time has expired. So if you could take that on notice, we're obviously very keen to get information. We're also, as you can tell from the question, we're very concerned about end-to-end encryption and the fact that there doesn't seem to be the tools to help prevent the serious nature of these crimes. So, but I do want to place on record our thanks for your submissions, and importantly the fact that you came this morning and allowed us to ask questions of you, and if you could follow up with the issues you've taken on notice, we'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. We'll move on and call our next witnesses.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to now welcome representatives from Not My Kid, from Safe on Social, and Miss West. We have Miss Pendergast here in person. The other witnesses will be via video. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And we have everyone else. Fantastic. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to the Senate committee has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? After each of you do that, then I will go to opening statements. Thank you. Ms. West, maybe we should start with you.
Good morning. My name is Madeline West. I come before you not as an expert, but as a mother, as an advocate, and as a victim of long-term aggressive childhood sexual abuse.
Thank you.
My name is Kira Pendergast. I'm the founder and CEO of Safe on Social. I work with children, teachers, parents on most days of the week around cyber safety and education in that sector.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
My name is Jen Hurry and I'm founder of Not My Kid. I work primarily with parents to educate them about the risks online. And this has resulted, this came about because my own daughter was a victim of an online predator when she was 9 years old.
Would you like to make an opening statement?
Certainly. So I founded Not My Kid following my daughter's disclosure that she had been in the process of being groomed via an online game when she was 9 while spending time at someone else's home. I had rules in place, so this came as quite a shock to me, but I responded with empathy and reassurance. At the time, she believed that the other person was also a 9-year-old girl, and after numerous in-game chats with the perpetrator, she was threatened with arrest if she told anyone what they'd been doing on the game. Essentially, what they had been doing was mimicking sex acts, which is a typical desensitization technique used by online predators. After this threat, she became afraid and did not return to the game. But these incidents, however, had a devastating impact on her. She was subsequently diagnosed at 9 with clinical depression and medicated for a period. For 2 years before she was able to disclose to me what had happened, she lived in fear. Her whole demeanor changed. She showed extreme signs of separation anxiety from me and began to eat a lot less. Following her disclosure, she informed me that every single day she had been afraid she may be arrested. She was filled with self-blame and shame. Predators typically ensure that a child feels a degree of responsibility, and it took some time to reassure her of her innocence. Following her disclosure, I started educating myself about online child exploitation. And I've discovered that it's essentially a silent problem. And by silent, I mean that the public at large is largely unaware of the dangers and frequently do not wish to engage with the issue. This makes it challenging for law enforcement, who rely on, among other tactics, reports to apprehend an offender. A colleague of mine who speaks to primary school-aged children reports that he's consistently seeing over 75% of children in primary school being allowed an internet-connected device in their bedrooms at night. And this leaves children vulnerable to online predators who may coerce them into self-producing online child exploitation. Now, one issue I've come to realize is that victims are frequently afraid to make a report, especially young victims. Over the years, I've had several adolescents reach out to me for support, many of whom are victims themselves, be it via social media or online games. And all have rejected my offer to assist them in making a report, either via the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner or directly to the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. Many are essentially afraid that they will be in trouble with law enforcement and frequently do not know how to approach their parents. Therefore, one recommendation I have would be to set up a support report hotline specifically for victims of online child exploitation under the age of 18, where they can be supported and reassured that they won't get into trouble and assisted in making a report if need be. Law enforcement do an incredible job in policing this crime type, but not all local police appear to understand the protocol when a parent comes to them. I recently had a parent who reached out to me whose 12-year-old daughter had fallen prey to an online predator via Snapchat. She had sent a compromising video of herself, and the perpetrator subsequently sent the video back, demanding more. Even though she blocked him, he contacted her repeatedly over a 12-month period using over 20 different profiles, demanding more videos. She eventually went to her parents, who contacted the local police, who told them to make a note of the incident, but that there was no need to report it. And I think this demonstrates how local police are not always equipped to deal with these issues, and further training should be considered, given how serious this problem has become. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Pendergast, do you have an opening statement?
I do, thank you very much. I would 100% back everything that Jenny has just said. In fact, there's a whole lot of crossover that I notice. I've been doing this work in schools and with government and businesses now for about 15 years, and I work very, very closely with Tweed Byron Command and train them often from a form of best practice. Now, what I've heard from speaking to the head of the command there, David Ruptel, and head of Byron Police, Matthew Keogh, is around the bureaucratic red tape. When they go to report things up, they're not quite sure when it's eSafety Commissioner, when it's AFP, a combination of both, and the child is therefore left in the centre of all of this. Reporting is minimal because kids are scared. They, you know, as someone that works in schools almost daily, when I walk into school, it's kind of like the cool auntie just walked in. And so the disclosures are quite incredible. And I've had, you know, at least once a week disclosures around sexual assault that's been simulated online, whether that be what I've written about in my submission. The one that sticks in the front of my brain that I will never forget was an 11-year-old describing full-blown sexual assault through to her in-game character in Roblox, which is a little game that targets kids in primary school from grade 3. This little one was so distraught, the principal said, "Is this a mandatory report?" So there's another layer. The principals don't know when to report what or where to report it. And in this particular case, the little girl kept saying, "It happened to me. It happened to me." Because the extension of their in-game character, there is no distinction between online and off anymore. I also agree with Jenny on the point when it is reported, there's a lot of kids being completely desensitised to all of this kind of behaviour from the onslaught of pornography right across the internet, and the fact that there is no age verification processes in place. That would literally need to be at device level to change that, because none of those, there's 4.5 million porn sites out there. They're not all going to change very, very quickly at all. So there's other things that we can do there. But the reporting that I see happening to local police is that people don't understand that they're not going to get in trouble. One of the things that I make very, very clear in my talks to children is if they do have something happen, and even if they have shared an image, for years and years and years they've been told that it is illegal to share an intimate image of themselves, so they do think they're breaking a law, therefore they're fearful. I remind them that worst case scenario is they will probably get a slap on the wrist from the police and told not to do it again, and the police will go after the perpetrator. But the average child and parent doesn't know that, neither do school staff, and that's where this needs to change, so there's no fear of reporting as an absolute start in this space that I could literally talk about for 6 hours. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. West, do you have an opening statement?
I do, and let me begin by thanking you for bringing this universally uncomfortable conversation to the floor. And it's uncomfortable because the very idea of a child being exploited, of their little bodies being violated, is uncomfortable, especially when it's for financial gain or for an adult's sexual gratification. But it's happening in numbers that we can't afford to ignore and we should never accept. For example, across New South Wales alone, sex crimes against children has increased by 4.2% per year for every year of the last decade. Yet our society, like many, fosters a conspiracy of silence where we continue to sweep it under the rug. And as a victim, I know intimately how broken the justice system is. And frankly, I'm tired of living in a world where exploitation and child abuse is allowed to flourish unchecked, where offenders' anonymity is safeguarded and where punishments, frankly, aren't even punitive, let alone preventative. My own varied public disclosure in the last few months has allowed me access to fellow victims, and I can tell you that the court of public opinion feels failed by law enforcement and absolutely betrayed by our judiciary. We know what's happening. We know what's happening in our homes. We know what's happening on our screens. We know we need to move faster than the technology, but frankly, parents, carers don't know how to do it. For example, this morning, I myself went on the AI GPT chat to ask the algorithm, how does law enforcement better extend its capabilities in the space of child exploitation? And it came up with 5 answers, those being stringent risk assessments and regulation of social media platforms where child exploitation is known to occur, harsher sentences for those who commit the crimes related to child exploitation, a national registry of sex offenders accessible to law enforcement and the public, legally enforced cooperation between the 3 tiers of law enforcement and social media providers, and stringent mandatory background checks for anyone working with or regularly exposed to children. Now, this AI draws its conclusions based on public knowledge and sentiment, and yet en masse we have failed every one of those points cataclysmically, which to me suggests that the very technology that is being used to harm our children knows better how to take care of our children than we do. The moment we hand a child a device, we give predators access to them. And drawing public attention to the dark web, to end-to-end encryption, to anonymous browsing, to Tor, to deep fakes is crucial, but the threat lurks where we least expect it, and that is, as Kira mentioned, on social media platforms, those things that we think are completely harmless. In my own experience as the mother of 6, I taught myself to game so I could better understand this new fad my children were obsessed with. And playing alongside my then 7-year-old twins in a game called Brookhaven within Roblox, my avatar was, I went into a chat room on invitation. My avatar was asked to engage in quite heinous, aggressive sexual acts. And then I was aggressively taunted by other players when I didn't. As Kira mentioned, these little avatars are extensions of our children. I know that my 7-year-olds dress their avatars up as they would like to be dressed up, give them names they would like to have. What I saw shocked me to the core, a grown woman. Now, what impact does that have on a 7 to 9-year-old child? And that is the demographic that these games target. So I have to ask, why are we not enshrining in law a need for mutual assistance requests between law enforcement and social media platforms to be streamlined on a governmental level? Because currently it can take up to 12 months for these requests to be processed. And by then, a predator who might be in Oregon grooming 13-year-old boys could have groomed another 50 children all around the world, as Jen's example was. Real change has to go beyond detection. We can't rely on that. It relies on prevention. And frankly, the population at large will only take heed if it sees law enforcers exposing grooming and child abuse material in a really timely manner. We need to see our judiciary hand down harsh, prohibitive sentences that offer real justice, that actually deter offenders. And I know that there is a reluctance, I can speak from my own experience, to go to police. Parents and carers are largely blind to the real threats of online engagement, and we frankly avoid involving police because we feel that reflects poorly on our capacity as parents. We prefer to deal with it ourselves. Taking a child's device away is never the solution because we live in a digital age. Our kids are more scared of losing their device than they are of the real-time consequences of predation online. And for victims ready to disclose, their first point of contact, as was my experience, is usually an officer on desk duty. A young constable is no more a psychologist than you or I and will handle the matter like any reported crime. But disclosures of this nature are generally coupled with extreme trauma, and sometimes their actions can dissuade a victim from pursuing a perpetrator. The average time it takes for a victim to disclose is 33 years. That's a lifetime of silence and shame and blame that they need to tackle before making that disclosure, and I know how that feels. So I would recommend creating a pre-reporting agency that provides counselling, support and advocacy for those coming forward. And I think that would be absolutely invaluable, and subsequently a nationwide standard could be set up where this professional agency reports directly to the relevant sexual offences criminal investigation team, and they can take it up from there. Because if we really want to stop the rot, then sentencing practices need to change. We need to signal to the public that we care. Compared to America and, say, Canada, comparative sentences handed down by Australian courts are an absolute disgrace. In America and Canada, online grooming can attract a 10-year jail sentence. In Australia, you commit tax fraud and you will feel the full weight of the law, but you destroy a child's life and you'd be unlucky to get a slap on the wrist. And we wonder why people don't take this issue seriously. That to me reflects just how little we understand the impact of intergenerational trauma and how little our lawmakers care. And the categorisation for child exploitation demonstrates this. I'll give you a very quick example. A recent case that was put before the judiciary had the description of the images which were downloaded from the offender's computer. It was described as a Category 4 offence, which depicted, I'm sorry, it upsets me just to talk about it, which depicted a infant, well, they describe it as prepubescent child penetration. What that image actually showed was a 6 to 12-month-old child being penetrated by an adult male's penis and ejaculated on. The initial language that I described is too sterile. In many cases, judges actually ask the prosecutors to tone down the descriptions of imagery or remove imagery that is considered too confronting. How can you rule on evidence that you refuse to see? Because that language barely registers. Those tasks, I would not for a moment suggest that everyone should see these images because they will haunt you. But those who are tasked with deciding appropriate sentencing have to bear witness to what child exploitation is, what it looks like, if they're ever going to hand down sentences that will punish it and act like a solid deterrent. So to wrap it up, I would ask, what is the social cost of failing to protect our children? And I can speak from personal experience. Walking wounded who can't walk, work, can't function, drug dependence, unsafe sexual practices, alcohol abuse, crime, eating disorders. Some even go on to perpetuate these crimes themselves. We shake our heads and we wring our hands at the thought of some monster seeking to harm our most vulnerable citizens, and that's our children. Yet most of us blindly refuse to acknowledge that that very predation is playing out in our towns, our schools, our streets, on our screens. Detecting these monsters is difficult, it's often impossible, but we can deflect them. And it begins with us as a society being prepared to face them, to understand them, and to stop looking the other way. And that means translating to our law enforcement that they have the capacity and our support to actually change the dialogue. Because frankly, they're right there, hidden in plain sight.
Ms West, thank you very much, and thank you for your opening statements. It's very evident to the committee on all the submissions that have come before us. We read it in our newspaper, the severity and the increase in child exploitation is a scourge on our society. And when people think about online activity, unfortunately, too many people think, well, that's children from another country. The reality is it's Australian children. Yes. It's our own kids. And I appreciate the passion that you all speak with. We have had difficulty getting social media platforms to come before the committee. We will pursue that. But social media platforms is one part of it. Law enforcement is another, and obviously the court system is another. But fundamentally, in my view, and I think from submissions and from your own evidence today, there's still a lack of awareness in our society. There's a lack of knowledge of parents who continue to use social media as an escape from having to be hands-on with their children only too often. How do we educate our community, our parents, our carers, our teachers, our law enforcement officers, that this is a scourge on our community? And what do we need to do? Now, it's a very broad question, but if you could summarise your views, but if there's anything in particular you want to add, you could also add that later. So perhaps with Ms Poltergeist, we go to you first. Yeah, Poltergeist, sorry.
It's okay, it's a long and complicated name. I'm very used to it. Look, I've got a lot to say about that. I think the education that's being brought to schools and things is far too slow. When I speak, you literally watch the scales fall out of people's eyes when they realise what is actually going on. It seems to me that the education in schools and to the police is at least 12 months behind where it needs to be. Occasionally something will pop up about, sextortion, which is the number one thing now, but the subtleties aren't delivered there. So when I work with the incredible police officers in Byron, for example, I'll tell them exactly what to look for, that there's an account that's been created that looks like another local child. The only difference is it's got a dot or an underscore under the end. And they're creating these profiles to look like another child and luring kids in that way. I don't think there's enough being done to educate parents and students around eliminating the fear from speaking up. A lot of people that work in the cyber safety sector are ex-police officers, so they come in with the don't. Well, don't doesn't work. It hasn't worked since I went to Mullumbimby High School in the 80s. It just does not work at all. So we need to teach them how to do it better and open up channels for them to speak. On the government's transparency reports, out of the 21,000 complaints that happened to the E-Safety Commissioner, when you do the numbers, that's only 0.08% of our national population that have actually spoken up, and we need to be asking why. It's because we're not doing this fast enough. There's a lot better ways that we could be doing it, and I have a million examples, but I don't want to chew up other people's time to speak here either.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms West, did you want to respond?
Definitely. I think that we need to, as you mentioned earlier, make it very clear to the population at large that just how insidious this is, that it's happening everywhere. If someone who has herself been a victim of aggravated sexual abuse as a child is not aware that the platforms that my children are using are exposing them to deeply encrypted location settings that I needed to be educated on to understand how to reset and protect my children, and are playing games where with just the click of a button, they can be welcomed into a chat room and be exposed to heinous sexual behaviour and language. The fact is the Victorian Law Reform Commission found that of every 1,000 children who were sexually assaulted, only 100 feel compelled to report. And of that, because of the pressures and the way the judicial system works and policing is currently working, 80% will withdraw before they go to court. And of those 100 that make it to court, only 6.5% of that number will attract a conviction. Now, in Victoria alone, at least half of these crimes are appealed, and half of those will be successfully appealed. Now, if we show those stats to the people at large, they're going, well, I'm not going to report because why would I bother? So we need to amend the way, it's a double-edged sword. We need to amend the way that people are able to approach law enforcement. As I mentioned, a pre-reporting agency with counselling and psychological assistance and support would be invaluable. But also we need to encourage people that if you go, you will get a result. Because I think that is what deters a lot of people and why the paradigm continues as it has, the sensibility that, well, even if I report, I'm not going to get an outcome. We need to change the narrative around that, and fast. If we're going to keep up with the technology, which is moving faster than our currently quite weak prohibitive legislations are, we need to act now.
Thank you.
I would just like to just jump in quickly. The reason I called the company Not My Kid is because that is the standard response that I get from parents. This will never happen to my children. My children are mature enough to handle this. We've had our conversations. You know, I've got a whole host of explanations that I've been given by parents over time. I guess I've thought long and hard about this question. How do we educate parents? Because this crime type is growing. And one of the things I've come up with, and I'm not sure how it would be implemented, would be mandatory education for parents at school. Because when cyber experts come to schools, usually the parents who do come to those talks are not the ones who actually need to be there. Exactly. It's the ones who actually have some idea of the risks already. And so if there was some way of, and I mean, again, I don't know how one would implement it, of actually having mandatory education for parents every single year, and I would say twice a year, hand out 4 dates, say 2 of these you've got to attend, maybe that would be one way forward. Because at the moment, I would say in my son's class, he's 9 in year 3, I am the only parent in that class who is vigilant. He's not allowed on online at all unless he's directly supervised by me or my husband. And I'm the only parent doing that. So we really have a lack of education.
Thank you. I have a couple of committee members who have some questions. So firstly, I'll go to Mr. Wood, and then I'll go to Ms. Miller-Frost. Mr. Wood, you have the call.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the evidence today, and especially coming out as victims. It really helps us as a committee understand what is required when it comes to recommendations. Just 2 things. I apologise, I'm just outside of this background noise. You spoke about the reporting. We similar issues when it comes to modern slavery. If you can put something maybe on notice to the committee of how you think that should work, would be greatly appreciated. And secondly, just on, you mentioned the National Child Sex Offender Register. What I'll just do now is we had the Australian Institute of Criminology undertake research into offenders, and there was this strong view that it was all pretty much strangers. In actual fact, 82% of incidents occurred in residential locations, 51 to 61% involved family members or known persons in and around someone's home. Repeat offenders always target new victims. The average time between child and sexual assault offences was between 5 and 7 years. Average victim was 11-year-old female. And of the 1,321 alleged offenders involved in 1,780 incidents involving 1,772 child victims. Obviously, the sad thing is everyone is a victim. Now, South Australia and Tasmania couldn't provide any research capacity on their databases. They couldn't search, and ACT's figures were so low it wasn't actually used. There's always been this view in the police force, no an ex-police officer, that it's always been kind of stranger danger, but until you kind of work the crime desk and see, sadly, children being abused over the weekend at sleepovers. So just do a review on the National Child Sex Offender Register, please.
Ms. West?
Yes, definitely. I'm very happy to speak to that. I think one salient point you've made is this reliance on the perception of stranger danger, to stay away from strangers. This is where the internet has become the new hunting ground. There is software available that will trawl people's personal and private accounts because, frankly, as you mentioned, 9 out of 10 cases, the perpetrator is known to the child and someone who has been invited into the child's home if they don't live under that same roof already, and that is a fact, that is a true statistic. In those cases, private accounts are no defence. Software control information that will give the perpetrator sufficient information to approach a child, be in person or online, and know enough about the child's life, have collated enough data points about that child to transform them from a stranger into a friend. And this is the battle that we are facing. The necessity of having a stringent background checks for anyone who works with children and an online sex registry, a sex offenders registry, is purely that people can be quite lazy in their approach in terms of employing, we all live hard and fast lives, allowing kids access to a particular sports coach. If we have that registry available, we have the opportunity at a click of a button to look it up. In Western Australia and Victoria currently, you can go to the police if you have suspicions about someone who will have exposure to your child, and they can confirm it. But that's not always enough, because either we have one of two choices. We start implementing these protocols, such as the sex offenders registry, or we become the kind of parent who has to attend every sports meet, every music class, every class, because frankly for me and my children, I can never see a justification for my child being alone with another adult, any adult, even adults who are my friends. So we need to create an environment where we can have frank conversations with our children about how they're being who they're being exposed to, and allowing them to come forward without there being any great penalties, i.e. I'm going to take away your device, or I'm going to stop you doing this or stop doing that. For me personally, I am quite stringent, a bit of a hawk with my children. I don't wrap them in cotton wool, but I can only speak from my personal experience. My focus is less on what they're missing out on by me excluding them from having exposure one-on-one to an adult, be that a piano lesson in the teacher's home, unsupervised, or going away on soccer camp. I'm focusing less on what they miss out on and more on them actively missing out on an experience that, as it did in my case, can absolutely destroy their life. So I've worked intensively with the sex offences criminal investigation team. I've worked with various tiers of law enforcement for many years now in prosecuting my own case. And every officer out there would agree we need a registry. We need a registry that law enforcers have access to, and the public in the right circumstances also do. Is there any extension you'd like to add to that question?
Anyone want to add anything now? Yes, just so that we can then move on. We're running out of time.
Yeah, I think what Madeline noted about the stranger danger not being stranger danger, and Mr Wood mentioned as well, I think that is the reason I wrote in my submission around some tighter access to childcare and primary school-based apps, because right now any parent can invite anyone pretty much into seeing photographs of children in school, even right down to their, toilet habits is, become monetised by these apps that if they're being used freely by schools, there's no protection from the Information Commissioner, and a lot of schools are using them for free. So tightening that up from day one would have to be a priority on my list for sure.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Ms. Miller-Frost. Are you there? Yeah, while we're waiting, are you there, Louise? No, we'll go to you, Dan, while we're trying to get Ms. Miller-Frost back.
Hi all, and thank you for coming in to talk to us about this. It's an extremely alarming situation that we're all in, and the more that we get involved in this, the more that we understand it too. So thank you very much for that. Ms. West, the podcast that you co-host, I take my hat off to you for doing this, and to Gary as well. I think it's a great thing, and it's something that had to come out at some stage, so that it gives parents an opportunity to understand what could be happening to their kids. Have you been getting a lot of feedback from not only law enforcement but also parents as to where this has taken them to change their opinions of what their kids are doing online?
Absolutely. The feedback has been phenomenal. We've had figures up to 30,000 people coming forward and for the first time speaking about their experiences. And what I would underline here is that currently, and this is the feedback I consistently get, people do not want to come forward because they believe, A, that law enforcement don't know necessarily how to handle the case. And as I said, often first point of contact is an officer on a desk who is not a psychologist, who will take down details and ask things like, Well, what day did that happen? What were you wearing? Why were you there? About events that might have happened 30 years ago, as was my case. Having an intermediary body, I think, is absolutely necessary so that when victims first come forward and disclose, that disclosure is met with support, understanding, and then the bare bones details can be reported by the agency to SOCIT or the relevant sex offenders unit. The feedback we've frequently gotten from police officers, and I've spoken to a lot of police officers, is that they feel hidebound by existing legislation and by lack of support and lack of funding to better support and facilitate mutual assistance requests between themselves and software apps and social media providers. As I mentioned earlier, I can elaborate on a case that an officer I've been working with told me about recently. They reached out to Snapchat because they had had a report of a 13-year-old boy being groomed by who they suspected was an adult male living in Oregon. Frankly, it's the click of a button for Snapchat to confirm whether that is the case or not. It took them 12 months to report back. By then, that boy was 14, completely disillusioned, didn't want to be part of it anymore. Now, if this online groomer was able to get into this little boy's life and extract enough information that this little boy thought it was another 14-year-old with him on Snapchat, how many other children is this person reaching their tentacles out around? Now, had they known straight away, the AFP could reach out to their US counterparts and have an arrest warrant issued. 12 months later, why waste your time? So when those kind of facts are presented to people, it dissuades them from reporting. And secondly, as I mentioned before, the stats that have come out under the Victorian Law Reform Commission are a good example, that the punishments that are being dealt don't meet the crime. So that is the most frequent feedback I'm receiving, not just from law enforcement officers, but also from the public at large. And the police will say they're banging their head against a wall when they present information to a judge and the judge asks them to dilute the descriptions of the online images that have been collected from someone's hard drive or remove images because they're too confronting. As I said earlier, how can you attract punishment to a crime, to evidence of a crime that you refuse to see? Because that happened to a child. That happened to someone's baby. And we're basically saying that that child is worth nothing if we're willing to give the perpetrator a slap on the wrist on the justification that they didn't actually commit the crime. Well, I'm sorry, the act is indefensible. And anyone who goes into the internet and purchases or downloads that image is as guilty as the person who perpetuated the crime in the first place.
Thank you. Your final question?
That's okay. I just recommend the members of the committee, I'm halfway through listening to this series, and I recommend the members of the committee do listen to it. And if you've got young kids, definitely get your partners to listen to it as well.
Thank you. Yes, I confess to doing the same thing. Yeah. We will now go to Ms. Miller-Frost. She does have the sound, hopefully, and the camera is working. So over to you, Louise.
I know, I've suddenly become an IT expert. Yes, thank you very much for all appearing. Ms. West, I wanted to particularly ask you about your experience with the online game. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. The current classification system seems to be very much around actual content and violence and that sort of thing. But it sounds from your experience that really the danger is actually other players and the ability to hive off into a private conversation. So I wondered if there was any move to look at that, rejigging that classification system so that it actually said, well, if there is the ability to go into a private space, then that is not a G-rated, it has to be for something higher, because I'm assuming that parents looking for a child-friendly game look for something that says it's G-rated or it's okay for kids. So I just wonder about your reflections on that game structure rather than the content being part of the classification.
Absolutely. Look, I think I don't know I'm not a tech whiz. I'm just mum and advocate, but I think there definitely needs to be classifications that specify that these offshoots, chat rooms, etc., are not regulated. It's not the body of the game. I mean, if you look at an example, and I think that Kira can speak to this at length, a platform like Omegle, which warns that this is a space where all sorts of stuff happens that pedophiles are attracted to, and rightly so. When you think about it, the online world is the ultimate place for predators to go because it encourages anonymity. It encourages lawlessness, and they're allowed to go in there and access children. Too many of us are using devices as childminders. I know we're all busy, but we can't afford to let our children be online unfettered. And the solution is not taking them offline because we live in an online world. This is our reality now, so we need to know how to deal with it. So what my solution for games like Roblox, and I think definitely Kira might be able to speak to this, I'm sure she can, there need to be regulations around all of the offshoots within the platform. The platform needs to be responsible for all of its content. My solution was creating an avatar who, as soon as I put myself actively in the game, when my children are playing, they can see that my avatar is active in the game, even if I'm off cooking dinner. But what that means is the rules and regulations I've put around my children's activity, which is do not engage with anyone who's asking to carry you, to have you lie down, to lie on top of you. Do not go into the chat rooms, no matter who invites you into the chat room. And if someone tries to friend you on that app, you do not automatically friend them. As Kira said, it just takes an underscore or a dot for that to be a predator in disguise, veiled as someone that they might already know. And I've found thus far, if my children see that my avatar is active, they follow the restrictions because they know that I can see what they're doing. But frankly, putting in big red letters that this game might involve these dangers can sometimes be a lure for children. Kids are curious, they want to dive into the taboo, so that in itself can be a very dangerous framework. I know that some tech companies have actually, private tech companies, have put forward the idea of creating AI bots or machine-led bots that act as children, who are capable of convincing conversations as children to lure predators. But that in itself is complicated by the current legislation, which disallows anyone from pretending to be a child online, and rightly so, because that very technology is what's luring our children into danger in the first place. It's a very complicated algorithm that really needs a lot of attention, and frankly, it's not currently getting the attention it deserves.
Your final question, Ms. Miller-Frost. You have another question? No, can't hear her, so we'll go to Senator Shoebridge.
Oh, thanks again, Chair. And look, thank you all for your evidence and the work you do throughout the year, not just when you're attending this committee. It's actually really essential. Some of the discussion that all of you have had, but particularly you, Ms. West, is about ensuring that there are adequate responses and adequate punishments as a way of being a preventative measure. And of course, one of the concerns that you have raised repeatedly is that violent offenders, predators, are able to protect their superannuation and sometimes have a very comfortable retirement protected by the law when their victims are suffering ongoing, dreadful impacts on their lives. Can you talk us through that a little?
Absolutely. Under the current legislation, the super of pedophiles is protected from victims coming forward for compensation. The complicating situation is that at the point where someone is brought in for questioning or charged, they can drop all of their assets into their super. And I'm talking about potentially millions of dollars, art, houses, title deeds, into their superannuation. That is then frozen and cut off from compensation claims. My position is this: you have destroyed someone's life. You have made them probably incapable of working. incapable of fostering healthy relationships, incapable of actually accessing the counselling and trauma support that you need because it's too expensive. Now, if a case is proven in court that that person committed those crimes, why do they get a cushy future? Why do they comfortably get to rest on their superannuation to see them through the rest of their lives when their victims are carrying a life sentence? That needs to be changed. Now, I understand that there are arguments about what about the families of predators, etc., etc. At the end of the day, maybe that in itself is a deterrent. The notion predator who's considering grooming, acting out their warped sexual fantasies on an innocent child might think, if the consequence is that my family, my children are stripped of their financial security in the future, I need to second guess my urges and control myself. Anything that can act as a deterrent is absolutely invaluable because we know detection is almost impossible. We've got to rely on what can deflect and deter predators.
And it's a question of getting the balance right in this part of the law, isn't it? Because we know absolutely the lifelong damage, not just emotional and personal trauma, but the lifelong economic damage the victims and survivors face. And the law, from what I understand your evidence is, the law should actually get the balance right and ensure that those who are found to have committed that violence and caused the damage, their superannuation should not be protected.
Absolutely, because currently victims are responsible for their own financial future and, more importantly, the taxpayer. If they make a claim at court, they're receiving victims' assistant compensation, which is a drop in the pond of what they really need to be supported. But that's the public paying for the acts of a predator who might be in jail, but given our current sentencing, will be released in a very short time and then gets to live a very cushy future while you and I pay for the damage that they inflicted.
The final question,
that's,
Senator
as I
Shoebridge.
understand it, thanks, Chair. That's, as I understand it, something you think should be a priority for federal law reform here, given the Commonwealth Parliament is responsible for the legislative measures that currently protect superannuation from those claims.
Absolutely, and I've joined forces with the Grace Tame Foundation, Andrew Carpenter from Webster's Lawyers and Fighters Against Child Abuse, and we've put forward a submission before the federal parliament to have that law amended.
Thanks very much, Ms West.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms High, I was wondering if you had anything further to add in terms of final comments. I think it's important to take this time. If there's a couple of points you want to make in terms of informing the committee of, we will be bringing down recommendations. So if you've got something to add, we would appreciate it. Ms Hoey, would you like to make some closing comments?
I'm very grateful that the Senate is looking into this. Obviously, from personal experience, I know firsthand the damage that can arise once a child has been exploited online. Fortunately, in my daughter's case, there were no images sent, but it did have a very profound impact on her mental health and continued through to her late adolescence. Fortunately, she's actually all right now. So I think that we do need robust action, and I would like to see a combination of parents, government, social media companies, gaming companies and police working together. Maybe that's a bit hopeful, but that's what I'd really like to see happen.
Thank you. And some final comments from you, Ms Pendergast.
My final comment would be to keep an eye on future trends and what's happening in the apps and how they're accredited, especially apps that are in schools and daycare centres and that are being used daily by people that may not be a stranger to a child who's all of a sudden collecting photos and selling them who knows where, all across the dark web with the details of the child. That and drawing the attention to parents that posting hashtag first day of school on Instagram is never a good idea, and the ongoing education, whether that become part of an orientation when their child starts school or something along those lines. It almost needs to be like a St John's Ambulance first aid certificate that a parent does to understand the absolute basics of how they're putting their child at risk online by having no education as well, and making sure that part of that is they're not fearful to speak up to law enforcement, and ongoing and faster training of law enforcement to keep up.
Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank each of you for the work you do every day. It is enormously important for the future of our children going forward, and I appreciate not only you appearing today but also for those who put in a submission, and we appreciate it and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Will you stand adjourned for 5 minutes while we bring the next lot of witnesses forward? Thank you. Good morning. I now welcome representatives of the Attorney General's Department, the Department of Home Affairs and E-Safety Commissioner. The Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matter of policy, shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? And so if you do that, please.
Assistant Commissioner James Watson from the Australian Border Force.
Peter Anstey, Acting First Assistant Secretary at the Department of Home Affairs.
Toby Dagg, Acting Chief Operating Officer, E-Safety Commissioner.
Tara Inverarity, First Assistant Secretary, Attorney General's Department.
Adam Knott, Assistant Secretary, Cybercrime and Cross-Border Data Branch in the Attorney General's Department.
Thank you. I now invite each agency to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of your remarks, I will invite members of the committee to put some questions to you. Who wants to go first? Mr. Watson?
Chair, I don't have an opening statement to make with respect to this. Happy to take the questions as they might have fallen.
The Department of Home Affairs doesn't have an opening statement. Thanks, Chair.
Nor does E-Safety.
And thank you, neither does Attorney General's Department.
No?
Fine, thanks.
Excellent. We'll go straight to questions. Mr. Republican.
I'll hold off for a little bit,
Okay.
if that's okay.
You would have heard, I'll kick off then, you would have heard some of the evidence. I saw some of you come into the room with our last witnesses. There's a scourge on our communities and there's quite clearly a lack of faith of victims in how they will be treated by law enforcement and our courts. The opening question would be, why aren't we doing more, and what's on the agenda for the Attorney General's Department?
Thank you very much for that question, and we do agree and share your concern about this very concerning area. From our perspective, a lot has been done to address some of the criminal justice challenges associated with child sexual exploitation and abuse, including recent reforms in 2019 and 2020, which strengthened our legislative framework for criminal justice responses to this area. That included introducing mandatory minimum sentences for particularly serious offending as well as repeat offenders, and also strengthened some of the offences. But we absolutely accept the need to not stop and rest on our laurels, and one of the deliverables that we have under the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse is to review the offences in this space, so we are looking at that. Another thing that we are looking at...
Can you tell us what the time frame that you're looking into it, what's the end date?
There is no set end date for that deliverable. And we would expect, for example, the recommendations out of this committee may be relevant to the work that we'll be looking to do under that deliverable. Another responsibility that sits with us is to look into the options for victims of crime and compensation and other civil remedies available to them, which is a complex area which I know was touched on in the previous witnesses to some extent in relation to superannuation, a complex area involving intersections with state and territory responsibilities, but that's another body of work that we're currently progressing. Again, with no fixed end date, it is arising under the national strategy.
Can I just ask one thing? You said on serious crimes.
Yes.
Every one of these crimes is serious. Like how you said that you've
Understood.
got tougher penalties now.
So
any part of this is very serious though.
Understood.
So,
What I was talking about was mandatory minimum penalties, which is where the court has no discretion in regard. That's a very careful balance to be drawn there. These offences carry very serious penalties, in many cases up to 25 years imprisonment. The serious offences threshold that I mentioned relates to where a mandatory minimum penalty kicks in, which is often something of particular interest to the Parliament in terms of that balance of judicial discretion versus mandatory minimums.
So with that, we heard from the last people that were in there earlier that we're saying that they're lucky to get a slap on the wrist, these people. So you're saying there's up to 25 years of imprisonment for these people.
For some offences.
Most of them aren't. Most of them aren't getting anything at all.
And the criminal justice framework that sits in the criminal code signals the maximum penalty for an offence, and in most cases that is quite high in this area. The application...
Can you give us some figures in relation to how many offenders have been sentenced to 25 years in the last 3 years?
I don't have those figures, no.
Can you take that on notice
Yes,
for
I
us?
can take that on notice.
Would you be able to just change it a little bit too, leave that one as well, but could you also have a look and see how many have been done 3 years and above?
I believe we have that data. Can I take that on notice and look at what we're
okay,
able to assist with by way of maximum sentences that have been imposed?
Yep.
Yep. Just to finalise my answer, the maximum penalties set out in the criminal code are intended to cover the worst possible situation, and I fully accept your position that these are all serious offences with really serious consequences for victims. That balancing of the discretion of what the conduct involved in a particular matter and how that fits with the sentencing regime does rest with the court, supported by submissions from the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions. So
The sad thing is with that though is that victim, no matter whether it's looked upon by a court as a small infringement or a large infringement, that victim's life is very different for the rest of their time.
we absolutely accept that and agree with that. And maximum penalties are one way to signal to a sentencing court the seriousness with which the Parliament views that conduct. And in that regard, these offences do generally carry quite high maximum penalties.
Okay.
There was evidence given this morning in relation to child sex offences register.
Yes.
And whether or not that should be made more readily available. What's the AG's department's view on that?
Certainly. And we, as you would be aware, the former government did commit to establish a national public register for child sex offenders that would involve a public-facing website, and some money was committed in the 2019-20 federal budget for that. That money was allocated to the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, who is quite involved in the child protection register already. That work has not progressed because this is an area where states and territories have primary responsibility and would need to amend their legislation in order for a register to be effective. This is an area where we have briefed the new government as to an update on what has been committed to and some of the issues that have been experienced in seeking to progress that commitment, so that further conversations can occur with the states and territories about the proposal for a national register and how that might be framed and achieved.
So that budget was 2019?
2019-20 federal budget, that's right.
And we're in 2023?
That's right. Unfortunately...
And no, I haven't asked my question as yet. So since 2019-20 budget to now, where every piece of evidence has come before this committee demonstrates that child exploitation has increased exponentially, there's been no further work done with the states to develop this register. Is that what you're telling us?
I'm not telling you that no further work has been done, but the legislative amendments that the states and territories would need to make in order to enable the register to be established have not been made.
A bit like the National Gun Register, until there's a real tragedy and then everyone wants to get on board and make the changes. It's just extraordinary that during the COVID period, there's so much evidence that child exploitation is so prevalent on social media platforms and in gaming that this isn't and hasn't been shown to be a high enough priority to sit down and work with the states. I mean, these children that have been exploited aren't just children from overseas. These are children in every state in this country. So is there a time?
I agree, and
So is there a time frame for when that work is going to be progressed in a meaningful way?
So unfortunately, it's not something the federal government can unilaterally progress, but we are continuing to try and work with the states and territories to resolve the question of whether they will be able to support the amendments that would be needed to make that register effective.
Do you know if there's any plans to put it on the National Cabinet's agenda?
Not necessarily National Cabinet, but we are seeking the Attorney General's views on appropriate ministerial level options at which it could be discussed.
Okay. Senator Shoebridge, you have some questions?
Oh, thanks again, Chair. Thank you all for your work throughout the year. My first questions are to the Attorney General's Department. You indicated that there was some work in terms of civil recourse for victims. Obviously, one of the key issues that's been raised with us is the fact that victims and survivors, even if they are successful in a civil action against their perpetrator, cannot access the superannuation because of the protective measures put in federal law that protects perpetrator superannuation from claims by survivors and victims. How far advanced is your analysis of that problem?
So thank you for the question, and this is an area where just this year consultation has been undertaken in relation to this issue. That work is being led out of the Treasury. They released a discussion paper in January this year about access to offenders' superannuation for victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, and put forward, I think, 2 proposals for stakeholders to provide comments on. I understand that consultation closed on the 16th of February, so very recently, and it would be a matter for the Treasury as to what the stakeholder responses have been and what the next steps might look like.
But obviously, Treasury may well have a perspective about wanting to ensure people are able to self-fund their retirement, which may be directly at odds with the justice perspective that you would hope would come out of the Attorney General's Department, being the view that victims and survivors should have fair access to compensation and the law shouldn't privilege the assets of perpetrators over survivors. Did the Attorney General's Department contribute to that review? And if so, did they contribute with a survivor-centric proposition?
The department was involved in the preparation of the discussion paper that was ultimately released by the Treasury. I'd have to take on notice what the substance of our contribution was.
And finally, on this matter, has there been any analysis of whether or not perpetrators, as identified by Ms West, when they become aware of a claim being made against them or potentially being made against them, are actually using the superannuation system to hide assets from victims and survivors, actively putting money, actively putting assets into their superannuation accounts to protect those assets from victims and survivors? Have you done any analysis of that?
Not that I'm aware of, but I can take on notice whether any other area of the department has been involved in that type of analysis.
And can you take on notice whether or not, to your understanding, Treasury has undertaken that for the purpose of the discussion paper?
We can consult with Treasury in preparing that response, yes.
Thank you. I just had some other questions to the Safety Commissioner, Chair, if there's a moment.
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Again, thank you for your work. I know it's complex and hard in this space from the eSafety Commission, and but I mean, one of the issues that has been of concern to numerous stakeholders is the lack of transparency on the draft industry codes. I know that your office effectively rejected them last week, sent them back to industry, but we still haven't seen those codes, the final iteration of the codes. They're private as between the industry and the eSafety Commissioner. Did you hear Meta's evidence today that they supported the publication of the guidelines now? And has eSafety Commission changed their view? And are you now willing to support the proactive publication of the guidelines?
Senator, thank you. We undertook last week during Senate estimates to consider on notice the release of those codes, and we've been consulting with industry on that front. So we'll be able to form a view once we've had opportunity to consult slightly more widely with industry. We've heard some views, but not all views. So I can't commit to you on during this hearing, but as we committed last week, it's something that we'll consider on notice.
Well, did you hear Meta's position? Meta's one of the big players in the space. Meta's position today that they support the public release of the codes. Did you hear that?
No, I was on the bus this morning, Senator. So that's useful to know. But Meta is one of many industry members involved in the construction of the codes. As you know, the codes cover 8 industry sectors. There are a large number of industry associations which themselves comprise many members. So we'll have to take some more soundings before we come to a view as to whether or not there's broad consensus within industry, and on that basis we'll be able to make a decision on the question that we took on notice last week.
Well, I mean, part of the frustration I have on this committee is that invitations were sent out to an array of industry players, Twitch and others, and I'll give Meta this credit, they have voluntarily appeared, but we haven't to this date therefore been able to understand the opinion of those other industry players. Are you able to tell us now what industry players or participants in the draft codes have agreed to the publication and which industry players are not agreeing to the release of the draft codes?
Senator, I know that we've been having conversations with a number of the industry associations. I don't think we've necessarily been able to consult with all of them. I don't have the information before me to give you a precise rundown as to who's provided a view. We'll be considering all those views, as I said, through the course of considering that question we took on notice, but I can't provide any further information now, I'm afraid.
Can you take
What
that
one
on
of the
notice?
industry
Sorry,
players-
Senator Shuby, can you take on notice so that you can provide to the committee what evidence you can in relation to that question?
Certainly will, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Shoebridge.
Yep, thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. One of the industry players that a number of stakeholders have contacted my office about in terms of being a significant danger and allowing their platform to be used for online predators is Twitch. Are you familiar with the popular streaming service Twitch?
Yes, Senator.
And are you aware of the concerns that child predators are using Twitch to systematically track children who are live streaming?
Yes, I am. I'm aware of media reporting to that effect.
What is your office doing in order to protect children from those dangers in relation to Twitch? What's your office actually doing?
Well, Senator, as we discussed last time, we are considering what further powers we might be able to apply in relation to subsequent BOSE notices, so that's the basic online safety expectations. We'll have an announcement later this week about the companies that are being targeted through that next round of basic online safety expectations notices, and we'll continue rolling those out through the course of this year and beyond. The eSafety Commissioner herself has had a number of conversations with Twitch executives and Amazon executives about these concerns and has expressed our expectation that Twitch do all it can to ensure the safety of its services. Of course, the kinds of services that Twitch provide are subject to aspects of the mandatory industry codes, relating to Class 1 material. That includes child exploitation material and abuse material, and some grooming material as well. So Twitch will be brought into that framework if the codes are registered by the E-Safety Commissioner, and we'll have further information to report on as that process makes itself clear.
All right. So, but until we get those codes, Twitch, owned by one of the planet's largest corporations, Amazon, is largely unregulated in this space outside of Class 1 material. Is that true? Is that what I'm led to believe from that?
When you say outside of Class 1 material, Class 1 material would accommodate the kinds of concerns I think you've raised, particularly those that relate to children being contacted for the purpose of grooming. But that goes to more fundamental issues around safety by design, which is what we're trying to get to through application of the basic online safety expectations powers. When you refer to the regulatory challenge, this is a systemic regulatory challenge. It's not one that we can deal with through piecemeal application of, say, removal notices. And that's what makes the codes such a critical part of the overall regulatory framework we're overseeing.
You see, part of the concern I have is even if we get the codes in place, are there actually people on the ground in these organisations who your office and other regulators can draw upon or compel to actually pull down material, make a safe online space? And in that regard, I note that Twitter, only as recently as January this year, was identified as a serial offender in this space by, I think it was an NBC News report showing that child sexual exploitation materials were easily found on Twitter. That doesn't seem to have been fixed by any systemic response by Twitter. And indeed, while those concerns are being raised, Twitter is in the process of stripping out the staff who would be responsible for dealing with that kind of material. Can you take us through what, if anything, that your office has been able to do with Twitter since the release of that NBC report in January this year?
Senator, we have been in contact with Twitter on a number of occasions. You'll recall, I think, through the course of Senate estimates last year that we wrote to Twitter, that the Safety Commissioner wrote to CEO Elon Musk, and we followed up several times with their trust and safety capability. We share your concerns about the stripping out of Twitter's capacity to respond to child sexual exploitation in particular. There are no Australian staff left here, and the Australian complement was a really critical component of Twitter's trust and safety apparatus as far as we were concerned. It's not only the presence of trust and safety personnel in a company that makes a difference, but the ability for a regulator like the Safety Commissioner to pick up a phone to a local representatives and say, hey, we've got a problem, or we want to raise something to your attention, we think that something is happening here, and provide that information. In the past, we found that to be very effective, and in fact, we had a really constructive relationship with Twitter, and quite an effective one, I thought, particularly when it came to child sexual exploitation material. Now we do have contact with regional representatives, but it's not quite the same as having someone that you can pick up the phone with and have a face-to-face meeting.
So should that be something we look at, compelling these global platforms to have local representatives who are on top of their brief and are authorised and empowered and resourced to deal with concerns raised by local regulators? And if they haven't got those resources, we should look at potentially restricting their access to our market.
Well, on the question of policy, Senator, I won't comment on that, but certainly our expectation would be that companies as large as Twitter and others should properly fund and resource local representatives for a range of reasons, not the least of which being regulatory environments are particular to a jurisdiction. It can be very frustrating dealing with a company like Twitter at significant remove, where they don't understand the particular regulatory conditions that apply within, in this case, the Australian jurisdiction. One of the core elements of the basic online safety expectations is a broad user safety component. We would say that adequately staffing and resourcing trust and safety personnel constitutes an obvious component of that particular element of the basic online safety expectation. So as I said, We'll be providing some more information this week about the next tranche of notices and the companies that are in scope, and we'll certainly keep the committee informed.
Senator Shoebridge, this will be your final question in this batch, and then we'll go elsewhere.
Thanks, Chair. It seems to me, and in fact to a number of stakeholders who my office has been engaged with, that critical to the success of any of these online safety codes is a requirement and a commitment for the local resourcing of the platforms. Is that a part of the e-safety officer's concerns about the codes, or is that something that the e-safety officer is looking to entrench in the codes, the requirement for local resourcing, so that they're not just on paper, but they can be delivered in reality?
Senator, I may need to take that question on notice to determine the best answer for you in relation to resourcing. I don't believe that the codes go to resourcing specifically. And when it comes to our concerns about the construction of the codes, in the broad, they relate to the kinds of matters that we've already expressed, which is the lack of commitment across codes in relation to detection of child exploitation material. I believe that the issue of resourcing is probably one best addressed through the basic online safety expectations, but not necessarily through the codes, because the codes focus on that specific issue of how companies deal with Class 1 and Class 2 content on their services. This first tranche of codes deals with the upper end of that issue, which is the upper end of Class 1 material. That goes to sufficiency of things like complaint handling, for example, detection and response. I'm not sure whether we've specified through our position paper that we published in April last year anything to do with resourcing locally, but I can certainly get back to you on that.
Thanks, Mr. Day.
The question that I have for Mr Wood relates to RAW, an organisation that works in Victoria by going into schools, raising awareness and education. Is there any funding available for that purpose to small groups through the AG or another agency?
Sorry, I think we would have to take that on notice. I'm not aware of any funding opportunities relating to that.
Okay, before we go to Ms Miller-Frost, if I could just ask, in relation to Meta, who gave evidence this morning, and there's been concern raised in relation to end-to-end encryption, it seems to me that from the evidence that they gave us, that I'm certainly not convinced that that's a good option for them to do without having the necessary tools. Do you have a view from the Commissioner's point of view?
Yes, Chair. We've expressed concerns over a number of years now about the move to end-to-end encryption on messaging services, particularly, and other services where we know that child exploitation material is routinely shared. In relation to Meta, as I'm sure the committee knows, I think in 2021 there were something like 26 million reports made by electronic service providers to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. The overwhelming majority of those were made by Facebook via its Messenger platform. Once that platform becomes end-to-end encrypted, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children has said that it goes dark for their purposes. So we know that there are opportunities that are presented through the production of that data to NCMEC to rescue children, to identify and rescue children. And we have deep concerns about the move to what is in effect a completely impenetrable exchange between end users that isn't subject to any kind of law enforcement or regulatory inspection.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms Miller-Frost.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic, lovely. We did have a conversation earlier on about sentencing, and I just wondered, in terms of sentencing overseas, are the regimes that we have in terms of mandatory, but also in terms of actual sentences that are given to people for various crimes, are we in sync with those? Because we did hear from an earlier witness that perhaps things were a bit tougher overseas and we were a bit more slap on the wrist. I'm not sure who that would go to.
think that might be one for the Attorney General's Department. I'm not aware of any international comparisons being done on sentencing, taking into account that every legal framework is quite distinct in how they frame their offences, and then, of course, every case is unique within how the facts and circumstances arise and are applied to the offence. So no, I'm not aware of any international comparisons that would indicate that sentences are higher in other countries.
Right, so there's no, I'm not looking obviously as a one-for-one sort of comparison, but taken as a whole, there's no indication where we sit internationally.
Not that I'm aware of. I guess what I would say, though, is we are of the view that Australia's criminal offence framework is world leading. It has been extensively reformed over the last sort of 10 to 15 years to ensure that particularly online child abuse material is quite comprehensively covered. So from the perspective of how our offences apply, I think we would say we are very well advanced. As to how that flows through to sentences, that's not something I could comment on.
Yeah, and of course we do know that we still have a very low conviction rate, which, for various reasons. So thank you for that question. Thank you for that answer. Can I also ask the E-Safety Commissioner, in the previous session, we had Ms West talking about her experience as participating on Roblox with her children and being invited into a private room and being hit on is probably a flippant way of putting it, but basically, proposition almost from the word go, with the assumption that she was a child. In terms of the sorts of classification and recommendations that you put forward, do you look at the actual game structure in terms of having these opportunities for children to be lured into private conversations, in terms of does that get recommended for a child's safety, or is it purely on the content of the game?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Mr. Miller-Frost. This is a really interesting question and probably goes to show some of the areas for potential reform in relation to the classification framework, particularly as we consider the challenges that are going to rush upon us very quickly with respect to the metaverse. When we look at Roblox as an environment, it's kind of a prototype metaverse, really. It's an immersive environment. It allows deep interaction. It allows for the creation of a parallel world. It's not like a computer game in the sense of it being subject to the usual classification processes. The challenge that we've got always when applying the classification framework is that the classification framework came out of the need to classify films on a commercial basis and then later computer games using very similar concepts to classify computer games. They start to become quite challenged when we think about the metaverse, and when we look forward to a time when we are using haptics to interact with digital environments that create not just the objective, visible, observable interactions on a platform, but a subjective sense of being there and being touched potentially, then we start to see some of the challenges inherent to applying that traditional classification framework to an environment like a fully immersible or fully immersive one such as the metaverse. So when it comes to answering your question, yes, we apply the guidelines to the classification code, which are focused on content as opposed to experience or as opposed to conduct.
Okay, and in terms of informing parents what they should be looking for, are there any programs in the sense of you running a program or government programs where we're actually telling parents, particularly for those sorts of online platforms that may perhaps have a classification in Australia, what they should be aware of, what they should be concerned of?
Yes, we provide a very
Because not every mother's going to be online.
No,
Yeah.
and we understand that. We understand that reaching parents can be one of the most difficult parts of our job as an educator. Parents are very time poor. Ms. West was talking about some of those challenges, and we can all relate to them with children. We provide a very extensive parents guide at esafety.gov.au that goes into a lot of the risks and benefits of using immersive technologies like Roblox. We also provide a fairly extensive guide to Roblox on the website as well and other similar environments. And we also have an immersive technology position statement, which you might be interested to read, which was written and published in 2020. We're looking to update that soon. But more broadly, we also fund, we also support the Trusted eSafety Provider program, where we work with private providers of online safety education to go into the community, to schools and other community spaces, to provide online safety education that we help shape through our community of practice, and that is anchored to some of the key messages of the eSafety Commissioner. So that's a way for us to scale our messaging. We don't have the resourcing to go into schools ourselves to reach the community more broadly, except through digital means. We also have a very extensive webinar series that is intended to reach Australian school children, but as far as the community is concerned, it's the Trusted eSafety Provider program that is our major focus.
Final questions?
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I've finished, thank you.
Thank you very much. I just have a couple of questions for Home Affairs in relation to encryption end-to-end policy change. Do you have any work that you've been doing in that area that you can advise the committee on?
Thank you, Chair. There are probably two aspects to update on just for visibility of the committee, the sort of distribution of policy between Attorney General's Department and the Home Affairs Department, as well as an update on some of the policy activities at Home Affairs. So for your awareness, the policy issues which relate to encryption, AGD leads on lawful access, electronic surveillance and child protection policy, whereas Home Affairs really leads on the cybersecurity, data security and technology security questions. In terms of a update in terms of our policy activities at the department, we continue to find signatories for the International Statement on End-to-End Encryption and Public Safety. You may be familiar with the statement from previous committee hearings. I'm happy to share a copy with you following this hearing, which is really an international collaboration to agree on positions around end-to-end encryption and make sure there are clear statements from like-minded countries in terms of our policy position, particularly as it relates to the rollout of end-to-end encryption across platforms. So that's, I think, to register that is the policy update for today, but happy to take other questions as well.
In relation to AUSTRAC, can you share any information in relation to their involvement in child exploitation material and the work that's been done at AUSTRAC?
Chair, with respect to AUSTRAC, I suppose from an operational point of view, we work with partner agencies across the Commonwealth. From an ABF's point of view, clearly our involvement looks to the question of people and goods coming across the border. Our aim, of course, is to be able to detect people and goods that might be involved in the abhorrent sort of practices associated with child exploitation, and then being able to refer those to other law enforcement agencies for appropriate investigations. Part of the process that we look through that is to be able to share information with our law enforcement partners, including AUSTRAC, and so to that extent, the information shared enables us to make sure that our efforts at the border are appropriately managed, because you can imagine, particularly in post-COVID activities where we're seeing quite a significant uptick in travellers. Goods are still moving across the border at a particularly high rate, but with travellers and of course any devices that or capability where people might be able to try and bring in abhorrent material through phones and computers and the like. The more information that we are able to transact amongst partners, particularly domestically and abroad, the more likely it is that our interventions are going to be well tailored.
Sorry, maybe I could just add to that. AUSTRAC sits within the Attorney General's portfolio since the change in the administrative arrangements orders. One thing we would say in relation to AUSTRAC is that we are continuing to try to work with the states and territories to obtain their agreement for AUSTRAC to have access to one of the key systems, the National Child Offender System. That would help AUSTRAC to provide a richer intelligence picture by matching suspicious financial payments with records held in that system. Although we wouldn't wish to speak for AUSTRAC, who I'm sure could provide information to the committee directly, that's one where we are seeking to broaden access to that system to allow that kind of financial intelligence picture to be overlaid.
Are they in fact not involved through sextortion and trying to track through that process?
I think that'd be a question better put to AUSTRAC as in relation to how they contribute to the law enforcement effort in relation to sextortion.
Well, we will. We're visiting them in the near future. In relation to the submission that was put into this inquiry from Home Affairs, it says that there were 62 cam detections at the border. What period of time does that cover? And it also mentions 72 children rescued or removed from harm. Were they overseas or were there Australian children also rescued?
Chair, with respect to the location of those children rescued, the nature of how we work with agencies, particularly federal police and overseas law enforcement agencies, will refer the imagery that we detect and the feedback mechanism, if you like, in terms of the children being saved. And as late as last week, I had information through to my office about detections that our officers are making at the border that resulted in work overseas through the Australian Federal Police, so that chain of information and inquiry leading to the recovery of children from pretty appalling circumstances. So the nature of those questions about where, of course, is something that is generally held by the Australian Federal Police through the work that they do. The Australian Border Force wouldn't typically hold that kind of information. It's generally given to us by way of feedback because it is that virtuous loop allows our officers, if you like, at the border to be able to make sure that our interventions are best targeted, if that makes sense.
So you couldn't tell us whether or not there were any Australian children?
I could not, Chair.
In the submission that was provided to us, it said that there were still challenges around information sharing, technology and border interventions. Having the capability to respond, do you want to add anything further to that and give us a bit more detail?
Chair, thank you. Obviously, it's the use of encryption technology because our officers at the border are trained to use certain electronic investigation tools. Those tools enable us to hold an electronic device until such time as we're satisfied as to the contents of that, what's on that particular device. Where the passwords aren't forthcoming, there's nothing that we can particularly do to compel that the production of that password, and that means that our officers can be delayed whilst we look at bypass technologies that may be able to get around the requirement of that password. So there's a time factor here, and as we've heard from witnesses this morning as I was listening, time is clearly of the essence when it comes to these sorts of activities. So that timing factor is important for us, because the faster that we are able to determine the content of particular devices, the quicker then we're able to act with respect to law enforcement partners.
My final question before I go to you, Dan, is one to the E-Commissioner and also Home Affairs, and obviously if the department has something to offer. But for evidence and for the briefings that we've had, live streaming is the most dangerous, and yet from this morning with Meta were unable to give us any satisfactory response, frankly, to whether or not that can be stopped immediately. But that seems to be the new choice of weapon in exploiting children. And it's not just children from overseas, it's Australian children. And, the perpetrators of that in terms can be people within their own families. So if anyone wants to, give us some evidence about whether or not that is a shared concern, which I assume it would be from all three agencies. So, Commissioner, would you, Mr. Dag, want to go first?
Chair. Yes, it's of enormous concern. That's why we focused our first set of BOST notices on Microsoft and Apple in respect of the Teams and Skype products with respect to Microsoft and Apple's live stream product. And unfortunately, the answers that we got were far from satisfactory. There was very little evidence to show that, particularly in relation to Skype, which we understand from our conversations with law enforcement colleagues is one of the major vectors for live stream child sexual exploitation, that they've really invested much at all in finding means by which they can detect and then cease a live stream transmission. We heard from Microsoft that it takes them on average 2 days to respond to a complaint about child sexual exploitation material appearing via the Skype service, which we think is too long, particularly when you compare it with some other responses through that set of BOST notices. So yes, we think that industry can do more and should be doing more in this area.
And I would second that as well. This is certainly not an area where it's the criminal law that provides the gap. We've got strong criminal offences covering sexual exploitation of children online, which includes live streaming, and some of those where there's aggravated conduct have maximum penalties of up to 30 years, which clearly is an indication of the seriousness of it. It's something we're discussing with our Five Eyes partners at a policy officer level to try and have a joined up effort. And it was also the theme of the inaugural digital industry event that the department hosted in February last year to seek to engage with digital industry as well, noting that it's an area where I think detection and enforcement is more largely the issue rather than the application of criminal laws in the area.
Thank you. Home Affairs?
I'd echo both those comments, only to add around the detection difficulties. Certainly in a live stream video environment, we're familiar that when it comes to end-to-end encryption, it's a particularly pernicious problem. Similarly, with the use of algorithms and promoting these videos, it's much easier in a static image-based environment to have technology tools to detect such images. In the live stream video environment, it's an additional problem.
Thank you. Dan?
We seem to be on the back foot with everything we're doing here. Like, we're reactive, we're not being proactive. What steps can we do to be proactive in really getting on top of this issue? Because from what you said earlier about having a child sex offenders register, I find it extremely hard to fathom in my head, and I think nearly everyone in this country would as well, the fact that it's a legislative issue within states. Like, states should be jumping on board with this straight away to make sure that we can make this work. I find it so hard to get through, and that's a proactive measure that we could be doing, where instead of being reactive to everything we seem to be, we need to make sure what measures are we having in place as this continues to evolve, which it will continue to evolve and change. Do we have things in place to try and get on top of this? That's to everyone too, by the way. Yeah.
I think it's hard to stay ahead of criminals generally, and I guess I can reinforce that over the last 10 to 15 years there's been an enormous amount of reform in this area to try and make offences technology neutral, less prone to collapsing when new technology emerges or new perspectives, and we think we've got a pretty robust framework there. In terms of the proactive challenges with industry, I might defer to you there from the e-safety perspective.
Thank you. I think one of the places I'd like to start to answer your question is possibly to reprise one of the themes that came out of the earlier hearing, which was around this notion of stranger danger, that sexual abuse of children is something that happens at a broad level through the community. I think sometimes because of the newness of internet-enabled technologies and because of the quite insidious ways they can be misused, we sometimes focus on that part of the problem as opposed to the issue of child sexual exploitation and abuse more broadly. I recall a conversation that I had with a senior law enforcement colleague who said that 80% of the work that they do is not internet-enabled technology, that it is the sexual abuse of children that occurs within families, within community groups, within other places that were examined through the Royal Commission. And indeed, when we look at the issue of online child sexual exploitation material being produced, it's as a consequence of the sexual abuse of a child. Those two things are not separate and shouldn't be considered separate. So our growing awareness of some of those truths has led to the reinvigoration of several international processes which we're involved in. And I think this goes to your question about proactivity in the area. The work of the We Protect Global Alliance, for example, is a multilateral umbrella organisation that is comprised of several hundred governments, industry members and not-for-profits. And what they're doing is not only to focus on the international dimensions, but really work with governments to find ways to strengthen local responses. You know, that work sort of sits within the Attorney General's Department, and it's something that we're very supportive of. The InHope network as well functions globally to strengthen individual members' capabilities around the detection of child abuse material and local jurisdiction-specific responses. So that might be a roundabout way of saying that there is a proactive energy associated with responding to this particular crime type, but we are dealing with a highly motivated offender community and one which is growing increasingly technologically adept. And so sometimes legislation isn't the best vehicle to stay abreast with those developments within offender methodologies and preferences, but we're trying.
And one other thing I might just add is just we are also seeking to be active in our region to build capacity in relation to this area. So we have some $4.1 million in funding over 4 years from 21-22 to strengthen Indo-Pacific capacity to tackle online child sexual abuse expectation. We've done some initial training to prosecutors in Thailand. We're delivering workshops on child-friendly justice practices, and that program of work will continue to build and roll out as we progress. So I guess that's another angle to which we're seeking to strengthen across the system, noting that Australia is you're driving abuse in those jurisdictions. It's an important role for us to play there as well.
We could just add very quickly as well. From a regulatory perspective, as the regulator, we're always looking for opportunities to apply our powers as well. So we'll be very active over the course of the next 12 to 24 months in particular in building out our capabilities in relation to the basic online safety expectations. We have proactive powers in relation to investigating child sexual exploitation material and its availability. And to the extent that our resources allow, we make full use of those powers.
I think from an Australian Border Force point of view, the more we look, the more we find. You know, that's the sad truth of the sorts of environment that our officers work in each and every day. I've mentioned previously at the border the compulsion to be able to unlock devices, to get access to devices where time is of the essence. Clearly, the ability for our officers to be able to undertake those sorts of inquiries, those sorts of examinations, to ensure that the legitimacy of material which is being brought into the country is being properly considered would be of an advantage. That's a very important step that our officers can do, because it does take can take considerable time to unlock and to assess that data if individuals who are crossing the border don't want to participate or cooperate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to summarise from the evidence today, there seems to be a general agreement that there's been a lack of education. I mean, how do you get the message out to parents and to carers and to kids when, West Australian reported on the 30th of January this year that insta shame, as teenage boys get sextorted, 8 kids get stung every day, that there's still a huge problem. How do we get the message out? I mean, we can have legislation about imprisonment for perpetrators. We can talk about stopping at borders. We can talk about games that obviously parents buy for their children, unaware, like Roblox, that children's games can have issues with going into rooms. How do we educate the Australian community? I think we've got to do that first, and then you worry about other countries after, because this is happening. I mean, I read in my local newspaper that locals have been caught in the sting. So people come from all walks of life. There's not like when I was growing up and you were told not to talk to strangers. This is happening in our lounge rooms. It's happening in kids' bedrooms. This is happening every single day. What are we going to do?
Chair, we absolutely share your concerns about the sexual extortion threat. It's a major challenge. It's a major challenge for law enforcement. It's a major challenge for the E-Safety Commissioner as well. Over the course of the last full quarter compared with the year before, we've seen a 184% increase in the number of reports made to us about image-based abuse. That's driven substantially by sexual extortion complaints made by young men aged 18 to 24. In fact, for the first time, when we looked at our statistics to look at the gender split between males and females reporting, 76% of reports are made by males now, compared to when the scheme first started, when it was overwhelmingly females. Attitudes are changing, so we are seeing a greater awareness amongst young people about the options available to them to take some form of positive action when it comes to encountering content or conduct that makes them feel uncomfortable online. So now more than 90% of young people take some form of positive action, which includes reporting to eSafety, which is great. One of the challenges we've seen through the research is a split between how young people are engaging with their parents in relation to what they're experiencing online and how their parents are paying attention to what they're being told. So there's about a 20-point split between the number of young people who say that they told their parents about something that was upsetting or concerning or disturbing online or threatening, and their parents remembering having that conversation. So we continue to work on options to address parental awareness and carer awareness and empower them with the knowledge and understanding of the tools and technologies that they need to become familiar with to ensure their children are safer online. That's a perennial challenge for us, for law enforcement, for everyone working in this space. One of the expectations that's been very clearly expressed by Minister Rowland is that we focus on awareness raising and education, and we'll be ensuring that that's delivered according to the Minister's expectations. So you can expect to see an even greater focus from the Safety Commissioner on those awareness raising activities.
I think too, from the evidence this morning, is that we still have a lot of work to do with breaking down the barriers so that children or adults that have been abused feel comfortable in coming forward, that they're going to be supported and that the law is going to be on their side. So We still have a lot of work to do, but I appreciate, along with my colleagues on the committee, for you appearing before us today. And if we do have further questions, we'll put them on notice to you. But thank you for what you do, particularly on a daily basis, in trying to protect our young people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have... So that concludes today's hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses who appeared before us, to Hansard and Broadcasting for their assistance. Any questions that we do put on notice, we would like those provided by the 6th of March this year. The committee stands adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Secretary, my colleagues.